You can almost smell London in the mid-17th century if you close your eyes and let your mind drift. It wasn't the pleasant kind of smell. Imagine the damp staleness of unwashed wool, the soreness of spilled ale soaking into wooden floors, and the faint tang of smoke from thousands of chimneys crowding the skyline. It was a city of 2 cents fermentation and fire, and if you lived there you'd hardly notice, because everyone else reeked too. The year was 1665 and London was bursting at its seams. Nearly 500,000 souls crowded its narrow streets, from the merchants in Cheapside to the beggars in Bishopsgate. Every lane seemed too tight for its purpose, its gutters clogged with the detritus of human life, fish bones, dung, vegetable peels, and the occasional dead rat. But the rat was only the beginning of London's troubles that year. Most people didn't think of rats as a problem. They were simply part of the landscape, like smoke or mud. The real concern was the price of bread, or whether the alehouse would have enough beer by sundown, because beer, not water, was the drink of choice for nearly everyone. Water, you see, was a dangerous gamble. It often came from the Thames, that sluggish artery winding through the heart of the city, which served equally well as sewer, rubbish dump, and occasionally grave. And so, even children drank weak beer, small ale, as it was called, a thin, mildly alcoholic brew that kept them from thirst without killing them. Brewers were as vital as bakers, and taverns as common as churches. There was no shortage of them either, over 2,000 alehouses by some counts, packed into a few square miles. Each one glowed with smoky lamplight in the evening, its benches sticky with spilled drink, its patrons loud and red-faced. If you had walked into one, perhaps in Southwark, you'd find a mix of tradesmen, sailors and washerwomen, all gathered to forget the smell of death outside. The air would be thick with the scent of yeast and damp wool. You might hear talk of the latest prices for grain, or rumours that a man in the next parish had fallen ill with the sickness. No one spoke its true name with comfort. Plague. It had arrived quietly that spring, first in the poorer parishes of St. Giles and St. Bride's. Just a few deaths at first, enough to raise eyebrows but not panic. London had seen plague before, after all. It came and went like the tide. But this time something felt different. The bills of mortality, weekly reports listing who had died and from what, began to show alarming increases. Plague appeared more frequently beside the names of the dead. Some Londoners, especially the wealthy, took the hint and fled to the countryside. The king himself, Charles II, retreated with his court to Oxford, but most people stayed. They had nowhere else to go, and so life went on, stubbornly, absurdly. Bakers baked, brewers brewed, and apothecaries sold their powders and tonics with great enthusiasm. The apothecaries' shops were curiosities in themselves, shelves lined with glass jars filled with mysterious powders and dried herbs, some of them labelled in Latin, others not at all. The air was heavy with the scent of rosemary and vinegar, believed to purify the air. A customer might come in seeking plague water, a tonic made with wormwood, angelica root, and various other ingredients, or perhaps a pomander, a small ball of spices meant to be held close to the nose to ward off bad air, miasma, they called it. Foul air was the enemy. If one could keep the nose protected, one might escape the plague's grasp. Londoners believed, as many had for centuries, that sickness came through the air, through foul smells and corrupt vapours. And so they burned things, lots of things. Fires were set in the streets, great smoky bonfires meant to cleanse the air. Tar, herbs, and even gunpowder were used, creating a stifling haze that hung over the city. It didn't help, of course. The plague was spread not by bad air, but by fleas. Fleas carried by rats, those same rats that scurried through cellars and granaries. But no one knew that then, and so the citizens of London continued their strange rituals of protection, smoking tobacco, carrying sweet herbs and drinking ever more. There is something almost admirable about their persistence. Even as the death toll rose, thousands per week by midsummer, Londoners found ways to carry on. They adapted to fear as humans so often do. The dead were buried hastily in pits, the plague pits, that would later become ghostly legends. The bellmen walked the streets at night, ringing their bells and calling out, "Bring out your dead!" But in the daylight, life resumed. Bread had to be baked, ale had to be brewed, and the city's merchants, ever practical, found ways to profit even in pestilence. One could buy plague remedies from itinerant peddlers, charms, powders, and miracle tonics of dubious origin. Quack doctors in long robes and beaked masks wandered the streets, offering their services for a price. These plague doctors, with their glass-eyed masks stuffed with herbs, became an eerie fixture of the city's imagination. Yet, In truth, few were actual physicians, most were simply opportunists. Meanwhile, inside the taverns, the conversations grew darker. Patrons whispered of entire families sealed inside their homes by order of the watchman, the doors nailed shut to prevent contagion. Red crosses were painted on doors, a mark of doom, with the words "Lord have mercy upon us" scrawled beneath. Still, the alehouses stayed open. For some, it was the only comfort left. The tavern keeper's wife might pour your drink with a cloth tied around her face, but she would pour it nonetheless. Because in times of plague, business was business. At night, the city was eerily quiet. The constant hum of trade and laughter faded into the sound of cart wheels on cobblestone, the dead wagons making their rounds. Yet even then, in the silence of fear, you might hear singing from an upper window. Someone, somewhere, trying to keep the darkness at bay. There were also the watchmen, tasked with enforcing quarantine. They patrolled the streets with lanterns, ensuring no one broke out of infected houses. It was a grim job. Some took bribes, others simply looked away. It was impossible to stop people from escaping. Hunger and fear were stronger than orders. By September, the plague had reached its terrible peak. Some 7,000 people died in a single week. The city's burial grounds overflowed. The stench was unimaginable. Even Samuel Pepys, the meticulous diarist who recorded the daily life of Londoners, wrote of the horror, the empty streets, the closed shops, the haunting stillness that settled over the city. And yet amid it all, there was still beer. The brewers, if they survived, kept their kettles boiling. They believed, as many did, that ale might protect them. After all, those who drank more beer than water seemed to live longer. Perhaps the alcohol offered some small defense, though they wouldn't have known why. Somehow this rhythm of ordinary life, of brewing, baking, and burying, became London's heartbeat during the plague. There was no sense of drama for those living through it, only endurance. Days bled into nights and nights into more days. And through it all, the city stood, scarred but standing. As autumn approached, the death toll began to slow. The weather cooled, and with it, the fleas became less active. No one understood the reason, but London breathed a cautious sigh of relief. People emerged from their homes, blinking in the thin sunlight. The bells still rang, but less frequently. Life stubbornly went on. But as the city began to recover, a new rumor spread through the taverns and markets, of something far worse to come. Some said it would be fire, others said it would be war. And as the year 1666 crept closer, Londoners had no idea that their trials were far from over. They had survived the plague, yes, but for how long? By the spring of 1666, London was a city trying to pretend it had forgotten. The Great Plague had thinned its population, emptied its homes, and left entire parishes hollow, but Londoners had always been a resilient breed. They swept out their houses, reopened their shops, and filled their ale mugs again. The worst was over, they told themselves. Life, smoky and ordinary, must resume, but the city that emerged from the plague was not the same one that had entered it. Beneath the surface of normalcy lay exhaustion, suspicion, and quiet ruin. Families were smaller, entire trades had vanished. Prices for labor had risen because there were fewer hands to work, and the poor laws were strained as orphans and widows filled the parishes. The city's infrastructure, such as it was, had deteriorated. Sewers were clogged, water conduits broken, and the streets, never pristine, had become matted with the residue of a year spent dying. Many houses stood empty, their doors still marked with faded red crosses, the paint peeling, the interiors long since looted. The air smelled of damp wood and mould, with the faint sweet rot of things long forgotten. Yet still, life carried on. By May, taverns were again full, apprentices quarrelled over dice, brewers argued about grain prices, and gossip about the king's mistresses returned to the fore. You could walk through Cheapside and hear merchants hawking goods. "The cries of oysters! Fresh oysters!" mingling with the clatter of carts and the rhythmic hammering from the blacksmith's forge. It was a strange kind of optimism, the kind that grows from sheer fatigue. People were simply tired of being afraid. But if the plague had shown them one thing, it was that London was always on the brink of disaster. The houses were packed tightly together, most of them built of timber and pitch, materials that burned quickly and well. Fire had always been a risk, but for a people who lived daily among smoke, who cooked over open flames, who lit their nights with candles and rushlights, fire was simply part of life. And so when the first flames of the Great Fire of London began to lick at the night sky on September 2, 1666, few thought much of it at first. Fires were common enough. A baker's oven, they said, had gone wrong. Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. It was a familiar story, a careless servant, an untended flame. The fire should have been contained quickly, but London's houses, dried from the summer heat and packed close as teeth, made perfect kindling. The wind rose, carrying sparks across the rooftops. Within hours, entire streets were burning, and still many residents refused to believe the fire would spread to them. When the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken and shown the blaze, he reportedly muttered that a woman could piss it out. He returned to bed. By dawn, his words had aged poorly. The fire had leapt from house to house, unstoppable. From the banks of the Thames, you could see it clearly, a vast, shimmering wall of flame that consumed everything in its path. People began to flee, dragging carts piled with whatever they could carry: feather beds, pewter plates, and the occasional bewildered goose. But in the chaos, thieves also thrived. As one diarist recorded, some did openly rob in the broad daylight, for all was confusion. Samuel Pepys, ever the chronicler of London life, gives us one of the clearest accounts of that week. On the second day of the fire, he wrote of climbing to the Tower of London and seeing an infinite great fire raging across the city, the wind driving it onward. All over the Thames, with one's face in the wind, you were almost burned with a strong heat. By the third day, the fire had become a living thing. It devoured entire parishes: Bread Street, Cheapside, St. Paul's Cathedral. The great cathedral, which had stood for centuries, was thought to be safe because of its stone walls, but inside were stores of books, paper, and wood scaffolding from recent repairs. When the flames reached it, St. Paul's became an inferno. Witnesses described molten lead flowing down Ludgate Hill like a river of silver fire. Those who fled to the fields beyond the city watched in stunned silence. From afar, London looked like a furnace, the night sky glowing red for miles. The fire burned for 4 days before the winds shifted and the flames finally died down. When the smoke cleared, over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and the homes of nearly 100,000 people were gone. London, the beating heart of England, had been reduced to blackened rubble and ash, and yet, in the strangest way, there was relief. The fire, though devastating, had accomplished what nothing else could. It had cleansed the city. The old wooden houses where plague had festered were gone. The filthy alleys, the damp cellars, the endless piles of refuse, all gone. For those who survived, the fire felt almost like divine intervention, a terrible mercy that scoured away the sins and sickness of the past. Still, the practicalities remained. Where were people to live? How could trade continue when the warehouses and shops were ashes? The markets were gone, the bridges damaged. Yet, even amid ruin, commerce resumed. Merchants set up stalls in the open fields. Taverns were re-established in tents and sheds. Bakers, ever resourceful, built makeshift ovens from the very bricks that had survived the blaze. King Charles II, seeing the devastation, took an unusually active interest in the city's recovery. He issued proclamations to control rebuilding and prevent panic. He ordered that new buildings be constructed of brick and stone, not timber, to prevent future fires, and he commissioned a committee, led by Sir Christopher Wren, to design a new, more orderly London. But rebuilding was slow. Many of the poor simply camped among the ruins or drifted to the outskirts of the city, living in shacks or sleeping under makeshift shelters. The smell of smoke lingered for months, mingling with the scent of wet ash and scorched earth. The brewers, remarkably, were among the first to resume operations. Beer, as ever, was essential, not just for morale but for health. The brewers who still had their kettles intact became local heroes, supplying small ale to the labourers clearing debris. In the months that followed, the rhythm of the city returned, uneven but determined. By spring, new streets began to take shape. St. Paul's, though ruined, would one day rise again, this time crowned by Wren's magnificent dome, a symbol of rebirth from ashes. But not all was reborn. Many of the old guilds had lost their halls, and countless records of apprenticeships, debts, and births were destroyed. The archives of lives, small and large, vanished overnight. For historians centuries later, the fire left gaps that would never be filled. And yet, what is most remarkable is how unremarkably Londoners treated their own survival. There were no grand speeches or parades, no sentimental reflections. They simply began again. A new city was to be built atop the bones of the old, and no one questioned it. Still, the trauma lingered in quieter ways. The fire had made people wary of neighbours, of foreigners who many initially blamed for starting the blaze, and of the fragility of their own existence. Every candle, every chimney, every wisp of smoke carried new meaning. In this new London, a strange paradox emerged: a city cleaner, brighter, and more orderly than before, but haunted by the memory of its own near death. The air, for the first time in memory, smelled less of decay and more of dust and lime from construction. But the people, those who remembered the plague and the fire, carried their ghosts with them. Some spoke of the fire as punishment for sin. Others saw it as the hand of providence, clearing the way for progress. Either way, it became a part of the city's story, not a tragedy to be wept over, but a fact to be accepted. Londoners were practical people. There was work to be done. By 1667, the scaffolds were everywhere, and the clang of hammers echoed through the streets from dawn until dusk. Stone Emerson's worked beside carpenters and glaziers. The city, once again, smelled of labor, sweat, sawdust, and hot tar. In the evenings, when work ceased, the taverns filled once more. You could find men who had lost everything sharing mugs of ale, laughing without joy but with familiarity. The tavern had survived, as it always did, the one constant in London life. There, under the low ceilings blackened by smoke, stories of plague and fire were told and retold. They were not tales of heroism or despair, but of endurance, ordinary endurance. The London that emerged from those twin calamities, plague and fire, would become the foundation of the modern city. Its streets widened, its buildings stronger, its people more resilient. But beneath it all lay a question that none could answer easily. Had they truly learned from what they had endured, or had they simply survived long enough to forget? By 1667, London no longer resembled the city that had existed just a few years before. The skyline was bare in places, open to the sky where rooftops once crowded together. Empty foundations sat like scars upon the ground, mute remnants of homes, shops and taverns that had once hummed with noise and life. Yet, amid this desolation there was motion everywhere. You could hear the hammering before you saw it, the steady, rhythmic thud of mallets on stone, the rasp of saws cutting timber, and the creak of pulleys lifting new walls into place. London, burned and broken, had become a city-sized workshop. The smell of wet mortar replaced that of decay, and the air was heavy with dust and the voices of labourers shouting to one another above the din. It would take years to rebuild what had been lost, but that was precisely what Londoners were good at: rebuilding, adapting, surviving. They had endured plague and fire, and still, they rose at dawn to work. They were not heroes in the grand sense, nor philosophers or poets. They were bricklayers, brewers, coopers, washerwomen, and fishmongers, the unrecorded backbone of the city. The king, Charles II, took a personal interest in the reconstruction. He walked among the ruins, sometimes in plain clothes, speaking with masons and architects. He wanted a city worthy of an empire, a London that could rival Paris or Amsterdam. And so, he turned to Sir Christopher Wren, the mathematician and astronomer turned architect, to draw up plans for a grand new capital. Wren imagined broad avenues, public squares, and grand buildings of stone, a city designed with symmetry and light. His vision was bold, almost utopian. But like most utopias, it faltered when it met reality. London was not a blank canvas, it was a stubborn survivor. Property owners wanted their land restored exactly as it had been before the fire, not rearranged into neat geometric patterns. Every plot of ground was fiercely defended, every foundation contested. The surveyors and architects soon realized that they would have to build a new city atop the footprint of the old. And so they did. Slowly, street by street, London returned, not as the city of Wren's imagination, but as something more pragmatic. The streets were widened, yes, but not dramatically. The houses were rebuilt of brick and stone, as decreed, but many retained their old irregular charm. The city that rose was safer, sturdier, but still unmistakably London, dense, chaotic, and alive. Wren, undeterred, would at least have his masterpiece St. Paul's Cathedral. Construction began in 1675, nearly a decade after the fire, and would continue for more than 30 years. As the dome began to take shape, rising above the rooftops like a promise, it became a symbol of renewal. Beneath it, life continued in all its ordinary complexity. The brewers resumed their dominance early in the city's rebirth. The old trade had not just survived the disasters, it had flourished. Beer, after all, was as necessary as bread, and because it required large amounts of fuel and water, breweries were among the first to benefit from improved fire regulations and the rebuilding of water conduits. For a brief moment, London became cleaner. The new building codes enforced proper chimneys, paved streets, and even designated waste disposal areas, though these were often ignored. Still, compared to the filthy lanes of pre-fire London, the new city was almost civilized. Apothecaries, too, found a kind of rebirth in the aftermath. During the plague years, they had been seen as purveyors of false hope. Their herbal remedies and aromatic waters had done little to stop the spread of death. But now, with the city rebuilding and medicine slowly advancing, their trade regained respectability. In their tidy shops, lined with blue and white delft jars, they mixed their tonics and tinctures, distilled waters of lavender for nerves, peppermint for indigestion, and laudanum, that potent mixture of opium and wine, for nearly every ailment. To a weary population, such things were indispensable. It was a time when science, faith, and superstition mingled freely. Across London, the Royal Society, founded just a few years earlier in 1660, met in smoky rooms to discuss experiments on air pressure, magnetism, and the circulation of blood. Men like Robert Hooke and Isaac Newton, curious minds shaped by a city of disaster and rebuilding, peered through lenses and recorded the unseen. There was something poetic about it. While bricklayers rebuilt the visible city, thinkers were constructing invisible ones, the worlds of knowledge and discovery. And yet, for the ordinary Londoner, life was still defined by the mundane. Work began at dawn and ended when the light failed. The Thames, cleaner now after the fire had burned away the worst of the filth, bustled again with barges carrying coal, grain, and timber. Markets reopened. The cry of the fishwives returned to the streets. At night, the taverns once more became the heartbeat of the city. There, among flickering candles and mugs of ale, people talked, not of philosophy or architecture, but of the price of bread, the weather, and the latest scandal from court. The tavern was a constant surviving every upheaval. Perhaps that is what held London together through so much calamity, not its monuments or its kings, but its capacity for ordinary life, for the habit of returning to work each morning, of finding comfort in the familiar rituals of drink, gossip, and toil. Still, the scars of the past lingered in quieter ways. The plague pits remained buried under the new streets and churchyards. Few spoke of them openly, but everyone knew where they were. Builders sometimes uncovered bones while digging new foundations, and the remains were quietly reburied. Life carried on above them. For many who had lived through both the plague and the fire, there was a strange, almost superstitious reverence for the city's endurance. London, they said, was favoured by God. Others muttered that it was cursed. Either way, they stayed. Few could imagine life anywhere else. The new London became a place of contrasts, elegance beside poverty, order beside chaos. Along Fleet Street, the rebuilt printing shops churned out pamphlets, sermons, and newspapers, feeding a growing hunger for information. In Covent Garden, fruit sellers and prostitutes jostled for space. And in the coffee houses, a new kind of social life emerged, lively, smoky places where merchants, poets, and scientists gathered to talk, debate, and trade ideas. It was a small revolution, born in the ashes of catastrophe. The fire had, in its own brutal way, cleared the ground for modernity. It had forced the city to rebuild not only its walls but its habits, to think of sanitation, of urban planning, of science and progress. The old medieval city was gone. In its place, something new was taking root. But for most Londoners, this grand transformation passed almost unnoticed. They were too busy living, working, drinking, marrying, and dying in the usual rhythm of things. Progress was not a dramatic march forward, but a slow, uneven shuffle, measured in pence of ale and loads of brick. By the 1680s, the city had more or less settled into its new shape. The skyline was punctuated by church spires, many of them Wren's designs, rising neatly above rows of brick houses. The streets were straighter, the alleys cleaner, the river a little less foul. The memories of plague and fire lingered mostly in the stories told to children by old men at tavern tables. And yet, beneath all this apparent stability, one could sense something stirring, the faint pulse of a new age. London was growing again, not just in size but in ambition. Trade expanded, wealth accumulated, and the city began to see itself not merely as England's capital, but as the centre of a vast, expanding world. Ships from the Americas and the East Indies docked at the wharves, bringing sugar, tobacco, and tea. Luxuries that would soon reshape daily life. The same city that had once drunk only ale would soon be addicted to caffeine. But that is another story entirely. As for the plague years and the fire that followed, they faded gradually into the background, too terrible to remember clearly, too formative to forget entirely. They lived on in diaries and records, in the designs of buildings, in the strange resilience of a people who had learned to endure anything. London had been purged by fire and death, and in that crucible, it had become something new, not just a city that survived, but a city that learned how to live with its own fragility. When you walk through modern London, through the narrow lanes of the city or the steps of St. Paul's, you walk on the bones of that transformation. Beneath your feet lie the ashes of the old world, and above them rises the product of centuries of ordinary persistence. The beer still flows, the bells still ring, and the air, though cleaner now, still carries a faint echo of the smoke that once remade the city, because that is what London truly became in those years. Not a monument to grandeur or tragedy, but a testament to endurance. And so the story ends, quietly, in the way that life itself continues, not with an ending, but with a return to work, to the slow rebuilding that never really stops. You might ask, as Londoners did after all that ruin and renewal, was it luck that saved them, or simply the human habit of not giving up? Imagine standing on the banks of the River Thames in the year 1700. The sun is low, and the water glimmers faintly under a haze of coal smoke and mist. Barges drift lazily along the current, their sails slack, their decks piled with barrels, coal, or sacks of grain. The air smells faintly of salt, but beneath it, always beneath it, lies something heavier. The river smells alive, but not in a pleasant way. It smells of decay, of life and death mingled together. This river was London's everything. It was the city's main road, its pantry, its drain, its mirror. It fed the city and slowly poisoned it, drop by drop. In the early 18th century, the Thames was not just a river. It was a living system of trade and waste, the artery that connected the city to the world. Ships from every corner of the empire arrived daily at the Pool of London, unloading sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from Virginia, spices from India. The riverbanks teemed with activity, dockers shouting, sailors drinking, women selling oysters and gin from battered carts. And into this same river, without a moment's thought, flowed the refuse of nearly 1 million souls. Every household had its own method of disposal. Some dumped waste into open gutters that led downhill. Others simply tossed chamber pot contents into the street with a quick cry of "Gardezel you! Watch out for the water!" From there, the filth found its way to the nearest ditch, and then, inevitably, into the Thames. The river carried it away, or so people liked to think. But the river never truly carried anything away, it merely redistributed it. At low tide, the banks revealed their secrets: heaps of rotting offal, broken pottery, dead dogs, and the occasional shoe or skull. The mud itself seemed to breathe, giving off a sour, sulphurous stench that made visitors gag. Locals, however, barely noticed. The smell was simply part of the city's air, a constant background note, like the chiming of church bells. And yet, despite its filth, the Thames remained the city's main source of drinking water. Watermen ferried it by the barrel to homes and businesses, sometimes filtering it through sand or cloth, but no amount of cloth could disguise its taste. Pepys, again our reliable chronicler, complained that Thames water was full of beasts, tiny wriggling organisms visible even to the naked eye. The rich could afford alternatives. They bought water piped in from the New River Company, a marvel of 17th century engineering that brought cleaner water from Hertfordshire to parts of the city. But even this clean water was often stored in open cisterns where birds, soot, and rats found their way in. For the poor, the river was both friend and enemy. It gave them work, holing, fishing, scavenging, and took their health in return. Waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera thrived, though no one yet knew why. Physicians still spoke of bad airs and corruption of humours. The idea that the water itself might be the killer was unthinkable. If you were a waterman, you learned to ignore what you saw floating by. The river was a place of labour, not reflection. Barges moved with the tide, ferries crossed endlessly from bank to bank. The Watermen's Guild was powerful, numbering in the thousands, their trade protected by royal charter. They were as much a part of the river as the gulls and the mist. But beneath the surface, the river was changing. By the late 18th century, London's population had exploded. The river, once wide and clear enough for salmon to thrive, had become sluggish and dark. The tidal flow still carried water in and out twice a day, but each tide seemed to leave behind more refuse than it removed. The Thames had become both the city's mirror and its conscience, reflecting, quite literally, what London had become. In winter, the surface sometimes froze. The famous frost fairs were held upon the ice, cheerful, chaotic gatherings where Londoners roasted meat, drank gin, and printed commemorative poems directly onto the frozen river. Behold the wonder of this age. One such print proclaimed, "The Thames congealed to solid stage." Beneath their feet lay tons of filth locked in ice, hidden but not gone. When the thaw came, it all returned, a slow, smelly tide of reminder. And through it all, the Thames continued to be used for drinking, washing, and worship. Baptisms were performed in its waters. Breweries drew from it for their beer. Laundry women scrubbed linen along its edge. It is almost astonishing that a city could thrive beside such a river, but London did, because the river's filth was invisible to understanding. It was simply the way of things. And so, decade by decade, the Thames became darker, thicker, slower. The line between water and waste blurred entirely. But change was coming slowly, as it always did in London. The scientists of the Royal Society had begun to take note of the river's condition. There were murmurs about contamination, about unseen forces that might cause disease. And there were engineers, practical men, who began to dream of a city where waste and water no longer shared the same course. Yet such dreams required money, politics, and above all, urgency, things London rarely summoned without catastrophe. The Thames waited patiently, quietly, flowing on. It would take another century and a truly unbearable summer before the city would be forced to reckon with its own reflection. By the turn of the 19th century, the River Thames had become both the beating heart and the open wound of London. It carried the goods that sustained the empire, yet it also carried away everything the city did not wish to see. Its dead animals, its refuse, its invisible sickness. When you look at engravings of London from that era, the Thames appears majestic, spanned by elegant bridges, crowded with sails. But the artist's ink could not capture the smell. Contemporary accounts tell of a stench that clung to the air, particularly in the summer months, when the river thickened with algae and human waste. The polite called it the effluvium. The poor had no name for it. It was simply the smell of London. To stand on Blackfriars Bridge in 1820 was to breathe the entire city. Every slaughterhouse, tannery, and brewery dumped its waste into the water. Animal blood, fish offal, and household slops drifted together in an endless grey current. The tides, instead of cleansing, churned it back and forth. Twice daily reminders that filth was the city's truest native resource. And yet, life persisted along the banks. Barges continued to ply their trade. Washerwomen knelt among the slime. Children played dangerously near the edge, their laughter mingling with the creak of ropes and the calls of watermen. The river was disgusting, but it was also familiar, a presence both loathed and loved. The river as a mirror of class. The condition of the Thames was not just a matter of pollution. It was a mirror of inequality. The wealthy lived upstream, where the water still ran clearer, away from the stench of the docks. Their houses drew water from private suppliers, or from the newer reservoirs fed by the new river, whose channels were far from the city's industrial heart. The poor, crammed into slums near the river's edge, in Southwark, Wapping, Limehouse, and Rotherhithe, drank, bathed, and laboured in the same water that received their waste. Londoners did not yet understand germs, but they understood misfortune. The poor seemed always to suffer the most from disease, and thus it was believed they brought it upon themselves. The miasma, theory of bad air, mingled comfortably with the moralizing of the age. Filth was seen not just as a physical condition, but as a moral failing. To be dirty was to be poor, and to be poor was to be suspect. In truth, even the wealthiest Londoners were drinking the same water. The river was one, and it did not care about boundaries. A frozen pause. The frost fairs every few decades. When winter was hard and the tides low, the river offered a strange reprieve. It froze. Between the 17th and early 19th centuries, the Thames froze solid enough to host entire fairs upon its surface. The frost fairs were among the strangest celebrations in London's history. Imagine the scene: vendors setting up stalls on the ice, butchers roasting meat over open fires, children skating on makeshift blades, printers producing souvenir pamphlets boasting of the coldest season in the memory of man. The river, normally feared for its filth, became a playground, a temporary city built upon its own frozen surface. One could buy gin, gamble, or even be married on the ice. But beneath that cheerful novelty was danger. The ice was never evenly frozen, and when it broke, as it inevitably did, stalls, people, and animals plunged into the black water below. The current carried them away, silent and final. The last great frost fair occurred in 1814, during the closing years of the Napoleonic Wars. A whole ox was roasted near Blackfriars Bridge, and a printing press produced commemorative cards reading, "Printed on the River Thames, February the 4th, 1814. After that, the climate warmed, and new bridge designs changed the flow of the river. The ice would never again form thick enough to bear a city. The frost fairs became a memory, and the Thames resumed its unending work of decay. The age of cholera, then came the cholera. The disease arrived in Britain in 1831, travelling westward from India along the trade routes of empire. It was swift, merciless, and mysterious. Victims often died within hours, their bodies contorted by cramps, their skin turning blue as dehydration set in. In the slums along the Thames, entire streets were struck down. The authorities were helpless. They cleaned the air, burned tar in the streets, and prayed. None of it worked. No one yet realized that the disease came from the water itself, from the very river that sustained them. Dr. John Snow, a quiet, meticulous physician, began to suspect the truth. His studies of the Broad Street pump in 1854, though famous today, were part of a longer battle to convince his peers that disease could spread through water. He collected evidence, mapped cases, traced the source of outbreaks, and found a common link: all were drinking from contaminated supplies. But official London dismissed him. The idea that invisible organisms in water cause disease seemed absurd, unscientific, even superstitious. And so, cholera continued its slow march through the century. Each outbreak followed the same cruel pattern: the poor died in droves. The rich fled to country estates. The government promised reform and delivered delay. The work of the river police amid this chaos: the river had its guardians. The Thames River Police, established in 1798, were the first professional police force in Britain, decades before Robert Peel's famous Bobbies. Their task was not public health, however, but property. They patrolled the docks to prevent theft of cargo, particularly from the West India trade. Still, their daily duties brought them face to face with the river's darkest secrets. It was the river police who hauled out the bodies. The suicides, the drowned sailors, the victims of crime. They kept ledgers, noting where each body was found, what clothes were worn, what valuables remained. The entries were plain and bureaucratic, yet each hinted at tragedy. Female unknown, approximately 25 years of age, found near Wapping Stairs, 3 February. Male, labourer, presumed drowned while intoxicated, recovered near London Bridge. The river was not only London's sewer but also its graveyard. The industry of filth. By mid-century, the Thames had become a machine, an industrial artery choked with human output. Tanneries, breweries, slaughterhouses, textile mills, and gasworks all discharged directly into the water. The city's population had passed 2 million, and yet its waste disposal system remained medieval. Cesspools beneath houses overflowed constantly, seeping into basements and wells. Night soil men, labourers who emptied these pits by hand, worked through the night, hauling their loads to dumping grounds on the outskirts of town. But demand far exceeded supply. Much of the overflow ended up in the nearest drain, and all drains led to the river. Even as the filth thickened, the water companies continued to draw drinking water from the Thames. Some intake pipes sat just downstream from sewer outlets. It was a perfect system of self-poisoning, made efficient by neglect. In 1849, another cholera epidemic struck, killing over 14,000 Londoners. Once again, John Snow presented his data. Once again, he was ignored. The Board of Health preferred to blame noxious vapours. Meanwhile, the river's colour shifted with the seasons. Brown in winter, greenish in summer, streaked with oil and froth all year. Fishermen spoke of dead eels floating belly up by the hundreds. Even the scavenging birds seemed fewer. The poet Matthew Arnold would later describe the Thames as a river of death, of floating corpses and floating commerce. And yet, commerce thrived. Barges still moved coal, grain and bricks. Dock workers toiled among the stink, their skin perpetually stained and their lungs full of soot. On some mornings, fog and smoke mingled so densely that the river disappeared entirely from view. The city seemed to hover on nothing but fumes. The river police continued to fish out bodies. Suicide was common, especially among the desperate poor. The newspapers reported these recoveries with unsettling regularity. A young woman, recently dismissed from service, found this morning near the custom house. An elderly clerk, reduced by illness, took to the river last night. His hat was found upon the steps. No one counted the dead precisely. The Thames was patient, and it never told its secrets fully. The unseen crisis beneath the surface. By the 1850s, London was on the brink of a new kind of crisis. One not of disease or crime, but of sheer disgust. The river's pollution had reached such a level that even Parliament could no longer ignore it. During hot summers, the stench rose in waves. Windows along the embankment were soaked with chloride of lime in vain attempts to mask the smell. Clerks worked with handkerchiefs over their faces. Members of Parliament fled their chambers. The river, once merely foul, had become unbearable. The newspapers called it the monster of pestilence. But even this horror was not enough. Not yet. The machinery of reform moved as slowly as the tide. The engineers had plans. A man named Joseph Bazalgette was already drawing designs for a vast system of sewers, tunnels and outfalls that would carry waste away from the city altogether. But such a project would cost millions and require years. It would take one final summer of unbearable heat to turn design into action. The Thames flowed on, thicker, slower, darker. The city leaned over it daily, as if in fascination with its own reflection, a reflection now blackened and foul. No one could yet imagine that this river of filth would one day become blue again, that salmon would return, that children might play along its banks without fear. That was still a century away. For now, London floated uneasily on its own waste, waiting for the day when the river would finally revolt. The summer of 1858 was long and mercilessly hot. By June, the River Thames had become a slow-moving broth of sewage and heat. The tides carried waste lazily between the bridges, spreading the stench through every crevice of the capital. This was the season that would come to be remembered, half jokingly, half horrifically, as the Great Stink. Even Londoners accustomed to foul air were unprepared for what that summer brought. The combination of relentless sun, stagnant water, and centuries of accumulated waste created a miasma so potent that it seemed alive. Curtains were soaked in vinegar, carriages were hastily rerouted, the very stones of the Houses of Parliament, standing proudly beside the river, absorbed the odour like a curse. Members of Parliament tried to continue their work, but they found themselves gagging at their desks. One account reported that curtains inside Westminster were treated with chloride of lime daily. Another claimed that papers wilted in the humidity, their ink running like sweat. Ministers fled meetings early, their faces pale, their eyes watering. The Times wrote, "It is the same Thames which has carried on its waters the commerce of a world which now, by one of those dreadful retributions of neglect, poisons the very city it has enriched." But for once, the metaphor was unnecessary. The smell was enough. The city that could not breathe the problem, of course, had been centuries in the making. By the 1850s, London's population had soared past 2.5 million, and its infrastructure had not kept pace. The sewers that existed were little more than open drains, designed to carry rainwater, not human waste. When water closets, the earliest form of flush toilets, became fashionable in the mid-19th century, they worsened the problem dramatically. Every flush sent more waste into the already overloaded drains, and all of it ended up, inevitably, in the Thames. Until the Great Stink, this had been a matter of discomfort, not disaster. The river had always smelled. But now, the heat made the problem impossible to ignore. The stench reached the royal palaces, the law courts, the counting houses, the clubs of Pall Mall. No one, not even the powerful, could claim to be untouched. In the weeks that followed, the newspapers ran front-page descriptions that read more like battlefield reports than civic updates. People described the Thames as black as ink, glutinous, and alive with decay. Dead fish floated in clusters, and bubbles of methane rose ominously from the depths. The historian Henry Mayhew, who chronicled London's working poor, described the river as a fetid sewer, where the air itself seemed to thicken and rot. And so, amid the stench, a strange kind of unity formed, the unity of disgust. The people of London demanded change, not for the first time, but this time the demand came from everyone, from the dock worker to the duke. Enter Joseph Bazalgette. The man who would save the Thames was not a politician or a nobleman, but an engineer. Joseph Bazalgette, a civil servant with a calm demeanour and a patient mind, had spent years studying the city's drains. He was already the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, a position that gave him both responsibility and, crucially, the ability to plan. Bazalgette had long argued that London needed a comprehensive sewer system, not just a patchwork of drains. His design was ambitious, a network of massive brick tunnels running beneath the city, intercepting waste before it reached the river and carrying it eastward, far beyond the city's limits. His idea had existed on paper for years, but Parliament had balked at the cost. The project would require enormous sums, unprecedented labour, and political will. Until 1858, no one had considered the stench worth the expense. Now, with Parliament half asphyxiated in its own chamber, Bazalgette's proposal found its moment. The engineering of cleanliness. Bazalgette's plan was a masterpiece of practical genius. It was both simple and monumental. He designed a system of intercepting sewers, enormous underground channels that would collect waste from smaller drains and carry it away from central London. In total, he planned more than 300 miles of sewers, with 82 miles of main interceptors built of over 300 million bricks. Each tunnel was lined with Portland cement and designed to flow by gravity, descending gradually toward outfalls at Barking and Crossness. There, the waste would be released into the Thames, but far downstream, where the tides could carry it away to the sea. The construction required more than brickwork. Bazalgette had to reshape the very edge of the river, His work gave birth to the Victoria, Albert, and Chelsea embankments, the elegant stone walkways that still line the Thames today. Beneath those promenades ran the great sewers, hidden from sight but transforming the life above. The design was so robust that it still serves London today, more than 150 years later. Bazalgette's motto might as well have been, "Build it twice as strong as needed." His tunnels were far larger than necessary for the population of the time. He anticipated growth, and he was right. The human cost construction began in 1859 and continued for over a decade. It was grueling work. Labourers toiled in deep, dark tunnels filled with foul air, water, and gas. Accidents were common: collapses, explosions, drownings. Yet the project pressed on, powered by a rare alignment of public will and political embarrassment. Thousands of men worked by lantern light, their skins stained by brick dust, their lungs filled with the damp of the earth. Above ground, London moved on, its citizens breathing a little easier as each new section of sewer came online. By 1866, a major cholera outbreak struck again, but this time, only the neighbourhoods not yet connected to Bazalgette's system were affected. The evidence was undeniable. For the first time, Londoners began to understand that clean water and sanitation were not luxuries but necessities. The work continued until 1875, when the last great outfall stations at Crossness and Abbey Mills were completed. These buildings, with their grand ironwork and vaulted ceilings, were not mere utility structures. They were cathedrals of hygiene, monuments to the mundane miracle of waste control. The river transformed by the 1880s. The transformation was visible and smellable. The Thames, once black and glutinous, began to clear. The tides ran cleaner. The fish returned, tentatively at first, then in abundance. London's relationship with its river changed, subtly but profoundly. No longer a source of disease and disgust, the Thames became once again a symbol of civic pride. Pleasure boats returned, promenades filled with strollers. Artists painted the bridges without holding their breath. It was not perfect. Industrial waste continued to flow into the river for decades, and the lower reaches near the docks remained grim. But the age of open filth was over. In 1878, when the pleasure steamer Princess Alice collided with a collier and sank near Woolwich, over 600 passengers drowned, not from the crash itself, but from the toxic waters. The tragedy reminded the city how fragile its progress remained. Yet it also spurred further reform, leading to stricter controls and ongoing improvements. Step by slow step, the Thames, that long-suffering witness to centuries of neglect, healed. A river remembered today, when you stand on Westminster Bridge at dusk and watch the lights ripple on the surface of the water, it's hard to imagine what once was. The river that tourists photograph, serene, dignified, reflective, was once a literal cesspool, yet the Thames still carries memory in its current. Beneath the water, in the mud, archaeologists continue to find layers of the city's history. Medieval pottery, Georgian clay pipes, Victorian glass. Each tells a quiet story of the lives that leaned over this river and threw something in, trusting the current to carry it away. The Thames never truly forgets. It is London's memory made liquid, and Joseph Bazalgette, the patient engineer who saved it, became a quiet hero. He received knighthood and the gratitude of generations who would never know his name. When he died in 1891, his obituaries were modest, but one sentence captured his legacy perfectly. He gave to the metropolis a gift that can never be repaid, the gift of health. Reflections beneath the surface. It is strange to think how much of human progress begins not with ambition, but with disgust. The Great Stink was not a visionary awakening or a noble movement. It was simply unbearable. People could no longer stand the smell, and yet from that discomfort came one of the greatest public health achievements in history. Cleanliness, as it turns out, is born not from beauty but from necessity. The story of the Thames is a story of endurance, of a river that survived centuries of abuse, and of a city that eventually learned to respect what it could not live without. Next time you see the calm water glinting beneath London Bridge, imagine what it once held: the waste of millions, the bodies of the lost, the stench that nearly silenced Parliament itself. The water still flows past the same stones, the same banks, the same city, but now clear enough to reflect the sky again. Perhaps that is the quiet miracle of London, that even its filthiest stories, given enough time, turn into something almost serene. If you were to wake in London around the year 1650, your morning would begin not with the sound of birdsong, but with the thick scent of smoke. It rose from every chimney and kitchen hearth, oak, coal, peat, or dung, depending on your means. In this smoky city, food was never far from fire. Cooking, like everything else in early modern London, was a matter of class and fuel. For the wealthy, kitchens were great stone chambers tucked beneath manor houses and townhomes. Servants bustled about amid hanging sides of meat, sacks of flour, and rows of pewter dishes. Great iron spits turned slowly before open hearths, sometimes by hand, sometimes by dog. The turnspit dog, a small, long-bodied breed, ran endlessly inside a wooden wheel, powering the roasting mechanism like a living cog. For the poor, there was no such spectacle. Their kitchens were often the same room where they slept, worked, and sometimes kept animals. A small hearth or brazier provided the only means of heat and cooking. Fuel was expensive, so many meals were boiled rather than roasted. Soups, pottages, and porridges that could stretch a handful of oats or beans into sustenance for days. The daily diet of a Londoner, the 17th century Londoner's diet, was shaped by season status and the city's bustling markets. In the better-off homes of merchants or lawyers, breakfast might consist of bread and ale, not coffee, which was only beginning to appear in select coffeehouses near St. Paul's. The bread was dense, often made from a mix of wheat, oats, and rye. Butter, when available, was salted and hard, cheese was sharp and aged. For labourers and apprentices, breakfast was much the same, if they ate it at all. Many began their day on an empty stomach, fortified only by ale. All was safer than water, which often carried disease. Even children drank it. Dinner, the main meal of the day, was eaten around noon. In wealthier households, this could be a grand affair: boiled beef, roasted mutton, pies filled with pigeon or eel, and vegetables boiled to exhaustion. Meals were served on pewter plates polished to a dull shine. Pewter, an alloy of tin and lead, was the standard for middling folk, though lead sometimes leached into food, adding a quiet poison to longevity. The rich dined on silver, the poor on wooden trenchers or even stale bread, trenchers used as plates and eaten afterward. The poorer classes lived on pottage, a stew of grains, peas, or whatever vegetables could be found, flavored with scraps of bacon or salted fish. Bread was the true staple, the dividing line between comfort and hunger. Markets and the theatre of food. If you walked through Cheapside Market or Billingsgate in the 17th century, you would find the air alive with noise and smell. Vendors shouted prices, fishmongers splashed water over glistening eels and cod, butchers hacked through carcasses, and bakers pulled fresh loaves from ovens. Food was bought daily, not stored. Most homes had no means of refrigeration, and salt or smoke were the only preservatives. In summer, meat spoiled quickly. In winter, supplies could run low. Street food flourished. You could buy a hot meat pie for a penny, a bowl of oysters, or a baked apple dusted with sugar. For many Londoners, these were the only cooked meals they ate. Taverns and cookshops provided communal eating spaces for those without kitchens, offering hot meat and cold ale to anyone with coin. Food was both necessity and performance. A grand dinner might be staged not only to feed but to impress, with elaborate displays like marchpane castles, sugar and almond paste moulded into miniature fortresses, roasted peacocks redressed in their feathers, and custards tinted with saffron. Sugar, imported through the Caribbean slave trade, was still a luxury. To sweeten a dish was to display wealth and empire alike. The kitchen as a workshop. Kitchens of the time were not tidy spaces. They were workshops of grease, smoke, and steam. The walls were often blackened, the floors slick with fat. Cooking was laborious, involving constant tending of fires and endless cleaning of spits and pots. Recipes, such as they were, appeared in household manuscripts, lists of ingredients with vague instructions. Take ye a fine hen, and seethe it till tender, with good broth and verjuice. There were no measurements, no temperatures, no times. Cooking depended on judgment, memory, and experience. Herbs were used liberally, not only for flavor, but to disguise the taste of meat kept a little too long. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, the enduring quartet, were staples of any garden. Salted fish was a daily presence, particularly on fasting days enforced by the church. The city's appetite for fish was so great that an entire economy of fishwives, porters, and river traders grew around it. And yet, despite this busy world of markets and kitchens, Londoners often suffered from malnutrition. Bread adulteration, mixing flour with chalk, alum, or even ground bones was common. Spices could be cut with dust. Milk was watered down. The closer you lived to poverty, the more you ate deception. Dining customs and etiquette. Eating was a social act, laden with ritual. In middling households, the family sat together at long tables, with the head of the house carving meat and distributing portions. Knives were personal possessions. Forks were rare until the late 1600s. Most food was eaten with a knife, a spoon, and one's fingers. Cleanliness was encouraged, though modestly enforced. Manuals of conduct advised not to dip your fingers too far into the dish, and to wipe thy knife upon thy bread, not thy sleeve. Guests brought their own napkins and sometimes their own cutlery. In taverns, manners were more relaxed. Jugs of ale were shared, and conversations loud. The tavern was both dining hall and social club, where tradesmen, scholars, and drunks mingled without hierarchy, at least for a few hours. At the higher end of society, dining was a performance of power. The nobility dined in courses, each one announced by servants, accompanied by music. Menus could include roasted venison, potted lampreys, spiced wine, and pastries molded into elaborate shapes. Servants stood behind their masters, silent and still. To dine well was to rule well, or at least to appear so. Taverns and alehouses, the real heart of the city. While the aristocracy dined in halls, the soul of London ate and drank in taverns. By 1660, there were thousands across the city, from the famous Boar's Head in Eastcheap to nameless alehouses down every alley. Taverns were more than places to eat. They were hubs of news, gossip, and politics. Sailors, poets, thieves, and clerks all crowded under low-timbered ceilings, eating boiled beef or pickled herring from wooden platters. Ale and beer were the universal drinks. Wine was imported. Claret from France, Saxe, kind of sherry from Spain, but far too costly for most. Gin would not yet appear in full force until the next century. Food served in taverns was hearty and plain pies, stews, roasted fowl, and puddings. Yet the atmosphere made even a greasy meal taste alive. Conversation roared, dice clattered, and smoke hung thick enough to cloud the rafters. Kitchens of disaster. Fire and smoke. London kitchens were always on the verge of disaster. Open flames, grassy surfaces, and wooden structures created constant fire hazards. The Great Fire of 1666 itself began in a bakery on Pudding Lane. The name alone a grim reminder of the city's combustible appetites. Afterward, new building regulations required brick and tile instead of timber, and chimneys were more tightly managed. But fires continued. In many ways, London's constant smoke was both its danger and its defining scent. For the cook, fire was both friend and torment. The temperature could not be precisely controlled. Baking was judged by the feel of the oven, roasting by the color of the fat. It took endurance, a kind of daily labor that left hands blistered and clothes permanently scented with wood smoke and lard. To cook was to sweat, to ache, and to endure heat. It was as much survival as art. The sound of supper, if you could listen to an evening in early modern London, it would not be silent. From open windows came the clatter of pewter dishes, the scrape of knives, the hiss of dripping fat. Street vendors shouted late into the night, "Hot pies! Fresh oysters! Apples and nuts!" Bells chimed from distant churches, mingling with laughter, quarrels, and the occasional song. This was the heartbeat of the city, the daily proof of life in a place that never truly slept. The smell of supper drifted through every alley, smoke, salt yeast, and the faint sweetness of roasted onions. It was both comforting and exhausting, the aroma of a city always eating, always hungry. Yet for all this energy, for all this bustle and invention, London's diet was still defined by inequality. While merchants carved beef by candlelight, beggars scraped bowls of thin broth. The poor lined up outside parish kitchens for scraps. Hunger was not an exception, it was a rhythm. And in this uneven city, food itself became a kind of history, a story of empire, class, and endurance. It is perhaps no surprise that from these smoky kitchens and crowded taverns emerged a culture of resilience, one that learned to stretch a crust of bread, to boil bones for broth, to make do with whatever the market or the river provided. But how did this humble fare evolve into the more refined, complex cuisine that would eventually shape the British table? How did pigeon pies and eel stews give way to tea, toast, and polite afternoon rituals? That transition, from hunger to habit, from necessity to taste, began in the generations that followed. If the wealthy Londoner dined to display his prosperity, the poor Londoner ate to survive another day. For most of the city's inhabitants, apprentices, labourers, widows, and street children, the story of food was not one of abundance but of endurance. To live in 17th century London was to live in proximity to hunger. Even as ships arrived at the docks laden with sugar, spices, and grain, there were entire neighbourhoods where bread was a luxury. The historian Thomas Dekker once described the city's poor as eating sorrow for meat and tears for drink. It was only a slight exaggeration, bread and pottage. The poor man's table bread was the foundation of all diets, but for the poor its quality was dubious. Fine white bread, known as manchet, was reserved for the upper classes. The poor ate brown or black bread made from coarse flour mixed with rye, barley, or even beans. Sometimes bakers added chalk or powdered bone to increase weight. a deception so common that city officials were forced to inspect bakeries regularly. A poor man's meal was often a bowl of pottage, a thick, bubbling stew that simmered over the fire all day. Into it went whatever could be found: peas, oats, roots, and, if luck allowed, a bone for flavor. It was never the same twice. Meat was rare. A small piece of salted pork might last a family an entire week, shaved thin and added to the pot for taste more than sustenance. Fresh meat was expensive and spoiled quickly. Fish, particularly salted herring, was more common and often distributed as part of parish relief to the destitute. Food and the church played a quiet but crucial role in feeding the poor. Every parish maintained what was known as a poor box, collecting coins from wealthier members of the community. These funds helped pay for bread, soup, and sometimes shelter. In times of crisis, plague, frost, or failed harvest, the church organized communal feasts called almsgiving, where bread and broth were handed out in churchyards. These were not acts of charity alone, but also of public morality. To feed the hungry was to prove the city's Christian virtue. Yet charity was uneven. In some parishes aid was plentiful, in others corruption and neglect left the poor to fend for themselves. Workhouses and the price of a meal. By the late 1600s, London had begun to formalize its relationship with poverty. The workhouse was born, part prison, part workshop, part shelter. Those who entered were given food and lodging in exchange for labor. Meals in these institutions were minimal: bread and broth, sometimes cheese, occasionally meat on Sundays. The goal was not comfort but deterrence, to make charity so unappealing that only the truly desperate would accept it. Descriptions of the food from these places survive in court records and diaries. One overseer noted the broth thin, the bread stale, yet enough to sustain life. That, in essence, was the philosophy of public welfare in Restoration London: to sustain life, but nothing more. Street food and the economy of pennies. For many of the poor, the street itself was the kitchen. London's alleys and markets teemed with food vendors who catered to those without hearth or home. There were pie women, who carried baskets of hot pies filled with meat scraps or vegetables. Oyster girls, who shucked and sold from wooden trays. Hot potato sellers, their carts steaming in the chill air, and milkmaids, who carried tin pails from door to door, calling out their wares. A penny bought a pie, a farthing bought a mug of ale. For a child, a crust of bread dipped in dripping might be dinner. Street food was cheap, fast, and risky. Hygiene was poor, and spoilage was common. But it offered independence, a way for the working poor to eat without charity or shame. The sound of vendors crying their goods became part of the city's daily rhythm.
Hot codlings! Fine fresh codlings! Buy my fat chickens!
Milk, milk, fair and fresh. Each voice echoed down cobbled lanes, a symphony of necessity. Drinking for strength. If there was one luxury universally shared by rich and poor alike, it was drink. Ale was the lifeblood of London. Brewed thick and cloudy, it was consumed at all hours, by children as well as adults. It was safer than water and provided a modest source of calories. The poor brewed their own when possible, weak, sour batches made from leftover grain. Those who could afford a little more went to the alehouse, where a penny could buy a pint and a bit of warmth. By the late 1600s, coffee houses began to appear, drawing merchants and scholars. But for the poor, such places were out of reach. Coffee was an imported luxury, more exotic than accessible. The alehouse, by contrast, was both tavern and refuge. It was where labourers rested their bones, where gossip and laughter softened the edge of hunger. Children, orphans, and the hungry city. No picture of London's poor would be complete without its children. Thousands of orphans and abandoned infants filled the city's alleys and parish houses. The Foundling Hospital, established later in the 18th century, did not yet exist in the 1600s. The fate of a poor child depended on the goodwill of neighbours or the parish. Some were taken in as apprentices, others begged or stole to survive. Records from Bridewell Prison list hundreds of young offenders charged with pilfering bread, cheese, or apples. Their sentences were harsh: whipping, branding, or imprisonment. But the cause was simple hunger. Even among working families, children contributed to the household economy. They fetched water, gathered fuel, and stood in lines for cheap bread. A meal shared between many small hands was an act of quiet resilience. The feast days, despite poverty, there were still days of celebration. Saints' days, harvest feasts, and Christmas brought rare abundance, even to the poorest homes. Parishes distributed loaves and ale, taverns offered discounted meals, and neighbours shared what little they had. One observer noted that on Christmas Day, even the poorest man will have meat upon his board, though his purse be empty. Such moments were brief but vital. They broke the monotony of want, reminded the hungry that they belonged to something larger than themselves. In these feasts, the city's contradictions were most visible. The same London that starved its poor also sought to feed them in ceremony and faith. Women and the kitchen economy in most poor households. Women ruled the kitchen, if one could call a single pot over the fire a kitchen. They stretched food, managed fuel, and made decisions that meant the difference between hunger and nourishment. Widows often supported themselves through cooking, selling pies, or hot food from home. The city's licensing system, however, made this difficult. Alewives were taxed and inspected. Unlicensed cooks risked fines or worse. Nevertheless, women's labor kept the city fed. They mended clothes, scrubbed pots, and bartered in markets, often while raising children and caring for the sick. Their work left few records, but it shaped the daily survival of millions. Imported goods and unreachable luxuries. By mid-century, London's docks were bringing in sugar from Barbados, spices from India, and tobacco from Virginia. The city was beginning to taste empire, but only a small fraction could afford it. The poor saw these goods only in fragments: a spoonful of sugar shared at Christmas, a whiff of spice from a market stall, a chipped cup that once held tea. Yet these exotic luxuries altered the city's imagination. People began to dream of other tastes, other possibilities. Even among the poor, sugar and spice carried a faint promise of escape, that the world somehow might offer more than pottage and bread. A city always eating itself. By 1666, as the Great Fire reduced much of London to ash, food shortages struck again. Grain stores burned, markets vanished, and thousands fled hungry into the countryside. Rebuilding the city meant rebuilding its food systems, its bakeries, markets, and taverns. New laws were passed regulating the price of bread and the cleanliness of public cookshops. Yet hunger persisted. London, it seemed, was always eating itself, devouring its poor to feed its progress. The sound of the poor man's supper. Imagine now, the close of day in a poor quarter, perhaps Southwark or Whitechapel, or the narrow lanes near the Fleet. A woman stirs her pot of pottage, tasting to see if there's enough salt. A man returns from labor, tired and silent. Children sit near the fire, waiting for the stew to cool. Outside, the cries of vendors fade. Church bells toll the hour. Somewhere, in a wealthier home, musicians play softly as silver plates clink. But here, in the small rooms of the city's poor, dinner is a slow ritual of survival. The quiet sound of spoons against wooden bowls, the occasional sigh of satisfaction, or the murmur of a prayer. It was not a grand feast, but it was enough to mark another day endured. And yet, as London entered the later decades of the 17th century, something began to shift. Trade expanded, fortunes grew, and a new class of merchants rose, neither noble nor destitute. With them came new tastes, new rituals of eating and drinking, and the birth of something quintessentially English. The meal as ceremony, not merely necessity. But how did the humble table of the poor transform into the ritualized elegance of tea, toast, and conversation? How did hunger give way to habit, and the alehouse to the parlor? By the late 17th century, London was no longer only a city of hunger and survival. It was becoming a city of habits, rituals, and taste. The fire had cleared its old timber alleys. New stone houses rose where ashes had been. Merchants, lawyers, and officials, that swelling class of the middling sort, began to shape a culture that valued civility as much as sustenance. Eating became not just a necessity, but a performance of restraint, politeness, and identity. The transformation of the table in the decades after the Great Fire of 1666, London's rebuilding included not only streets and markets but manners. The smoky kitchens of the past gave way to cleaner, tiled spaces with chimneys and ovens designed for efficiency. Printed cookbooks began to circulate among households, no longer handwritten heirlooms, but printed volumes available for purchase. The most famous was The Accomplished Cook, by Robert May, first published in 1660 and reprinted for decades after. It provided hundreds of recipes, from a fricasse of chickens to pudding in a bag. May's work was not simply a list of meals. It was a social guide. It instructed readers in presentation, order, and style, reflecting a society where refinement was increasingly accessible. The act of eating itself began to change. Forks, once considered effeminate, became common. Napkins were laid, knives were dulled to avoid unsightly gestures. The table became a theatre of composure. The arrival of tea, coffee, and chocolate, perhaps no single set of commodities altered London's dining habits more than tea, coffee, and chocolate. They arrived through trade, bitter gifts of empire. Ships from the East India Company carried tea from China, coffee from the Levant, and cacao from the New World. By the 1670s, these drinks were transforming not only what people consumed, but how they gathered. Coffee houses spread rapidly through the city. By 1700, there were more than 2,000. Each one was a small republic of conversation, where news, business, and politics mingled with the steam of boiling kettles. But coffee houses were male spaces. Women, excluded from their benches and debates, found their own refuge in the drawing rooms of home, where tea became the drink of choice. Tea's rise was extraordinary. At first a medicinal curiosity, sold by apothecaries for extravagant prices, it soon became the centerpiece of polite domesticity. A hostess could offer a cup of tea to visitors without impropriety. It was warming, refined, and social. The tea table replaced the tavern as the setting of conversation. To pour, stir, and sip became gestures of belonging to a new kind of London, one that prized decorum over drunkenness, order over chaos. Tableware and trade, this new civility demanded its own tools. China cups, porcelain saucers, silver spoons, once exotic imports, became prized possessions. The design of the tea service itself became an art form, often reflecting the vast geography of empire. Chinese porcelain, West Indian sugar, and London-made silver all gathered upon a single tray. Sugar, once a rare spice, now became ubiquitous. Imported through Caribbean plantations, it sweetened not only tea but the English conscience, a luxury purchased at the price of enslaved labor. On every tea table in London sat a small, gleaming monument to global exploitation, the sugar bowl. Few paused to think where it came from. The birth of breakfast. Before this period, breakfast had been a meager affair, ole and bread, sometimes cold meat. But with tea, coffee, and sugar, the morning meal transformed. By the early 1700s, toast joined the table, thin slices of bread browned over coals, served with butter or honey. Porridge and pottage gave way to lighter, more elegant meals. Breakfast was no longer merely sustenance, it was a ritual of beginning. The morning tea, taken quietly or shared among family, became a symbol of respectability. Even among the lower classes, imitation followed. Those who could not afford fine china used tin cups or earthenware mugs, but the gesture, the performance of civility, remained the same. Eating as identity. As Londoners grew wealthier and more cosmopolitan, they began to define themselves through what and how they ate. To eat well was to be respectable, to eat carelessly was to risk appearing coarse. Manuals of etiquette circulated, teaching everything from how to hold a knife to how to converse over supper. The tavern, once the city's social heart, began to lose its moral standing. Alehouses were still everywhere, but the polite avoided them. Instead, they dined in private homes or public dining rooms attached to inns, where conversation could occur without the intrusion of the drunk or the poor. This distinction between public and private eating, between necessity and ceremony, marked a turning point. The merchant's dinner. A merchant's dinner around 1700 might begin with soup or boiled fish, followed by roasted meats, vegetables, and a series of pies and puddings. The meal concluded with fruit, nuts, and wine. Tablecloths were white, candles steady, and conversation polite. Guests were seated according to status. Servants moved quietly, replacing dishes in what was called service to la franaise, multiple dishes set out at once, allowing diners to choose freely. It was an age of abundance, but also of control. Overeating was frowned upon. Gluttony was no longer a sign of wealth, but of vulgarity. The well-bred Londoner was expected to eat modestly, but expensively. The meal was an act of performance, a rehearsal of civility, empire, and commerce all at once. Cookbooks and domestic knowledge. Women, too, gained new authority through food. The printed cookbook was as much a domestic guide as a social one, allowing women of the middling classes to demonstrate refinement through culinary skill. Authors like Hannah Woolley and later Eliza Smith published collections that mixed recipes with household advice, how to preserve fruits, make perfumes, or manage servants. Cooking became a form of literacy, a way for women to assert competence and social standing within the boundaries of the home. The kitchen, once smoky and rough, became the domestic heart, clean, organized, and respectable. Tea and the moral order. By the 1720s, tea was so central to British life that it carried moral meaning. Satirists like Addison and Steele wrote of its virtues in The Spectator, praising it as a drink of moderation and reason. At the same time, moralists condemned the alehouse as a site of sin and decay. Tea was linked to virtue, sobriety, and female respectability, all to disorder, idleness, and vice. The contrast was not accidental. It reflected a deeper social divide. The middle classes, rising through trade and enterprise, defined themselves against both the idle rich and the drunken poor. To drink tea was to signal belonging to a new moral order, industrious, pious. and polite. The empire on the table, every London table now bore the marks of empire. Tea from China, sugar from Jamaica, spices from India, coffee from Arabia, all converged in the hands of people who had never seen those places. The city's growing appetite for these imports drove colonization and slavery, yet few paused to see the connection. When a Londoner sweetened his tea, he participated in a vast system of human labor and suffering. The polite ritual of the tea table, for all its refinement, was built upon chains unseen. The silence of supper by the early 18th century, dinner had shifted later in the day, moving toward the evening. Candlelight meals became the norm among the polite, often accompanied by music or conversation. The once raucous clatter of taverns gave way to measured voices and deliberate calm. Supper was to be taken quietly, with gratitude and grace. Even among the working classes, some of these manners trickled down. Families began to eat together more regularly, to bless the meal, to imitate, however modestly, the order of the rich. Eating had become a moral act. The end of the pewter plate, the pewter plates of old London, gradually disappeared, replaced by ceramics and porcelain. The change was more than material. It symbolized an evolution of identity. The pewter plate belonged to a world of smoke, grease, and hunger. The porcelain cup belonged to one of trade, taste, and reflection. And yet, beneath the surface of civility, the same city persisted, markets still crowded, poor still hungry, cooks still sweating over fires. The illusion of refinement had not erased the struggle beneath it, only hidden it behind lace and china. Reflections by candlelight. If you could stand at the threshold of a London dining room in the year 1725, you would see a world remade. A woman pours tea into delicate cups, her guests murmuring about news from Parliament. A silver sugar bowl gleams in the candlelight. The children sit quietly, learning to hold their spoons just so. Outside, the cries of street vendors echo faintly. Someone sells pies to passing labourers. Smoke still drifts from 1,000 chimneys. London has changed, but its hunger remains, transformed into desire, ritual, and pride. Eating has become a mirror. What one consumes and how one consumes it now defines who one is. The pewter plates are gone. The pigeon pies have cooled. The city that once dined by firelight now sips tea by candlelight, believing itself civilized, and in some ways it is. But beneath the polished surface, the same story hums, a city forever balancing appetite and restraint, survival and civility. And so ends our long meal in London, from the smoky kitchens of the poor to the porcelain cups of the polite. It is a story not only of food, but of transformation, of how hunger becomes habit and habit becomes heritage. Yet one must wonder, when refinement replaces necessity and manners replace hunger, what part of our humanity do we leave behind with the grease and the smoke? By the late 17th century, London was no longer only a city of hunger and survival. It was becoming a city of habits, rituals, and taste. The fire had cleared its old timber alleys. New stone houses rose where ashes had been. Merchants, lawyers, and officials, that swelling class of the middling sort, began to shape a culture that valued civility as much as sustenance. Eating became not just a necessity, but a performance of restraint, politeness, and identity. The transformation of the table in the decades after the Great Fire of 1666, London's rebuilding included not only streets and markets but manners. The smoky kitchens of the past gave way to cleaner, tiled spaces with chimneys and ovens designed for efficiency. Printed cookbooks began to circulate among households, no longer handwritten heirlooms, but printed volumes available for purchase. The most famous was The Accomplished Cook, by Robert May. First published in 1660 and reprinted for decades after, it provided hundreds of recipes, from a fricasse of chickens to pudding in a bag. May's work was not simply a list of meals, it was a social guide. It instructed readers in presentation, order, and style, reflecting a society where refinement was increasingly accessible. The act of eating itself began to change. Forks, once considered effeminate, became common. Napkins were laid, knives were dulled to avoid unsightly gestures. The table became a theatre of composure. The arrival of tea, coffee, and chocolate, perhaps no single set of commodities altered London's dining habits more than tea, coffee, and chocolate. They arrived through trade, bitter gifts of empire. Ships from the East India Company carried tea from China, coffee from the Levant, and cacao from the New World. By the 1670s, these drinks were transforming not only what people consumed, but how they gathered. Coffee houses spread rapidly through the city. By 1700, there were more than 2,000. Each one was a small republic of conversation, where news, business, and politics mingled with the steam of boiling kettles. But coffee houses were male spaces. Women, excluded from their benches and debates, found their own refuge in the drawing rooms of home, where tea became the drink of choice. Tea's rise was extraordinary. At first a medicinal curiosity, sold by apothecaries for extravagant prices, it soon became the centerpiece of polite domesticity. A hostess could offer a cup of tea to visitors without impropriety. It was warming, refined, and social. The tea table replaced the tavern as the setting of conversation. To pour, stir, and sip became gestures of belonging to a new kind of London, one that prized decorum over drunkenness, order over chaos. Tableware and trade, this new civility demanded its own tools. China cups, porcelain saucers, silver spoons, once exotic imports, became prized possessions. The design of the tea service itself became an art form, often reflecting the vast geography of empire. Chinese porcelain, West Indian sugar, and London made silver all gathered upon a single tray. Sugar, once a rare spice, now became ubiquitous. Imported through Caribbean plantations, it sweetened not only tea but the English conscience, a luxury purchased at the price of enslaved labor. On every tea table in London sat a small, gleaming monument to global exploitation, the sugar bowl. Few paused to think where it came from. The birth of breakfast. Before this period, breakfast had been a meager affair, ale and bread, sometimes cold meat. But with tea, coffee, and sugar, the morning meal transformed. By the early 1700s, toast joined the table. Thin slices of bread browned over coals, served with butter or honey. Porridge and pottage gave way to lighter, more elegant meals. Breakfast was no longer merely sustenance, it was a ritual beginning. The morning tea, taken quietly or shared among family, became a symbol of respectability. Even among the lower classes, imitation followed. Those who could not afford fine china used tin cups or earthenware mugs, but the gesture, the performance of civility, remained the same. Eating as identity. As Londoners grew wealthier and more cosmopolitan, they began to define themselves through what and how they ate. To eat well was to be respectable, to eat carelessly was to risk appearing coarse. Manuals of etiquette circulated, teaching everything from how to hold a knife to how to converse over supper. The tavern, once the city's social heart, began to lose its moral standing. Alehouses were still everywhere, but the polite avoided them. Instead, they dined in private homes or public dining rooms attached to inns, where conversation could occur without the intrusion of the drunk or the poor. This distinction between public and private eating, between necessity and ceremony, marked a turning point. The merchant's dinner. A merchant's dinner around 1700 might begin with soup or boiled fish, followed by roasted meats, vegetables, and a series of pies and puddings. The meal concluded with fruit, nuts, and wine. Tablecloths were white, candles steady, and conversation polite. Guests were seated according to status. Servants moved quietly, replacing dishes in what was called service à la française. Multiple dishes set out at once, allowing diners to choose freely. It was an age of abundance, but also of control. Overeating was frowned upon. Gluttony was no longer a sign of wealth, but of vulgarity. The well-bred Londoner was expected to eat modestly, but expensively. The meal was an act of performance, a rehearsal of civility, empire, and commerce all at once. Cookbooks and domestic knowledge. Women, too, gained new authority through food. The printed cookbook was as much a domestic guide as a social one, allowing women of the middling classes to demonstrate refinement through culinary skill. Authors like Hannah Woolley and later Eliza Smith published collections that mixed recipes with household advice, how to preserve fruits, make perfumes, or manage servants. Cooking became a form of literacy, a way for women to assert competence and social standing within the boundaries of the home. The kitchen, once smoky and rough, became the domestic heart, clean, organized, and respectable. Tea and the moral order. By the 1720s, tea was so central to British life that it carried moral meaning. Satirists like Addison and Steele wrote of its virtues in The Spectator, praising it as a drink of moderation and reason. At the same time, moralists condemned the alehouse as a site of sin and decay. Tea was linked to virtue, sobriety, and female respectability, all to disorder, idleness, and vice. The contrast was not accidental. It reflected a deeper social divide. The middle classes, rising through trade and enterprise, defined themselves against both the idle rich and the drunken poor. To drink tea was to signal belonging to a new moral order, industrious, pious, and polite. The empire on the table. Every London table now bore the marks of empire. Tea from China, sugar from Jamaica, spices from India, coffee from Arabia, all converged in the hands of people who had never seen those places. The city's growing appetite for these imports drove colonization and slavery, yet few paused to see the connection. When a Londoner sweetened his tea, he participated in a vast system of human labor and suffering. the polite ritual of the tea table, for all its refinement, was built upon chains unseen. The silence of supper by the early 18th century, dinner had shifted later in the day, moving toward the evening. Candlelight meals became the norm among the polite, often accompanied by music or conversation. The once raucous clatter of taverns gave way to measured voices and deliberate calm. Supper was to be taken quietly, with gratitude and grace. Even among the working classes, some of these manners trickled down. Families began to eat together more regularly, to bless the meal, to imitate, however modestly, the order of the rich. Eating had become a moral act. The end of the pewter plate, the pewter plates of old London gradually disappeared, replaced by ceramics and porcelain. The change was more than material. It symbolized an evolution of identity. The pewter plate belonged to a world of smoke, grease, and hunger. The porcelain cup belonged to one of trade, taste, and reflection. And yet, beneath the surface of civility, the same city persisted: markets still crowded, poor still hungry, cook still sweating over fires. The illusion of refinement had not erased the struggle beneath it, only hidden it behind lace and china. Reflections by candlelight. If you could stand at the threshold of a London dining room in the year 1725, you would see a world remade. A woman pours tea into delicate cups, her guests murmuring about news from Parliament. A silver sugar bowl gleams in the candlelight. The children sit quietly, learning to hold their spoons just so. Outside, the cries of street vendors echo faintly. Someone sells pies to passing labourers. Smoke still drifts from 1,000 chimneys. London has changed, but its hunger remains, transformed into desire, ritual, and pride. Eating has become a mirror. What one consumes, and how one consumes it, now defines who one is. The pewter plates are gone. The pigeon pies have cooled. The city that once dined by firelight now sips tea by candlelight, believing itself civilized. And in some ways it is. But beneath the polished surface, the same story hums: a city forever balancing appetite and restraint, survival and civility. And so ends our long meal in London, from the smoky kitchens of the poor to the porcelain cups of the polite. It is a story not only of food, but of transformation, of how hunger becomes habit and habit becomes heritage. Yet one must wonder, when refinement replaces necessity and manners replace hunger, what part of our humanity do we leave behind with the grease and the smoke? The morning air over Whitechapel smelled of smoke and molten metal. It was the 1690s, and the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, already a century old, stood as one of London's most extraordinary workshops. Here, amid roaring furnaces and sweating men, the future sound of time itself was taking shape. Bells of every size leaned against the walls, some destined for distant parishes, others for ships that would sail to India or the Caribbean. But among them all, the largest commissions were reserved for London's grand churches, bells that would soon measure the city's heartbeat. At the centre of it all was a name: Great Tom. The return of the bell. When St. Paul's Cathedral burned in 1666, its bells had melted into unrecognisable shapes. The loss was not just physical, it was emotional, symbolic. The city's great bell, which had tolled for monarchs and martyrs, was gone. So, when Sir Christopher Wren designed the new St. Paul's, he ensured that a new Great Tom would hang in its tower. The task of forging such a bell fell to the Whitechapel Foundry, then under the care of Richard Phelps, a man known for both his temper and his precision. Phelps' foundry was more than a workshop, it was a cathedral of sound. Here, every mould was made of clay mixed with horse dung and human hair, a recipe perfected through centuries of trial. The molten bronze, poured at nearly 1,000 degrees, glowed like sunlight turned liquid. Great Tom was cast in 1709. Weighing over 5.5 tons, it took weeks to cool and even longer to tune. When finally hung in St. Paul's, it was struck for the first time on December 31st, 1716. The sound rolled across the city like thunder. It marked not merely the hour, but the restoration of London's voice. The bells of order. By the early 18th century, London had entered an age of regulated time. Commerce, empire, and navigation demanded precision. Ships sailing from the Thames needed to set their marine chronometers accurately, a matter of life and death when crossing the oceans. Banks opened and closed at strict hours. The postal system, too, depended on timekeeping. Letters were sorted, loaded, and dispatched according to fixed schedules. To meet these demands, the city's churches became unofficial public clocks. The bells of St. Mary Bow, St. Clement Danes, and St. Martin Inn, the fields, all told the hours. But each was still a little different. In one parish, noon came 3 minutes earlier than in another. A man could walk from Holborn to the Strand and Lowes, 5 minutes on the way. The city was a patchwork of hours. This might seem trivial, yet in a city built on commerce, Minutes began to matter. The first clockmakers' revolt, it was around this time that the Clockmakers' Company, founded in 1631, began to assert its authority. They petitioned Parliament to regulate the trade, arguing that unlicensed makers produced inferior and inaccurate clocks that caused the citizens great inconvenience. The clock was now a matter of public trust. In 1713, the company succeeded in tightening its charter. No one could legally make or sell clocks in London without permission. Their Guild Hall, near Fleet Street, became a sanctuary of craftsmanship, the beating heart of London's horological world. These artisans, hunched over benches lit by candles, represented something extraordinary, the mechanical mind of an empire. Every gear, spring, and escapement they shaped was an act of defiance against chaos. The long search for accuracy, but even as clockmakers refined their craft, accuracy remained elusive. Pendulum clocks, first perfected by Christian Huygens in the 1650s, revolutionized timekeeping. Yet they were still vulnerable to temperature, humidity, and poor workmanship. A clock that gained or lost a few seconds a day might seem precise, but over a year, that meant hours adrift. Scientists began to obsess over precision. Among them was John Harrison, a carpenter from Yorkshire who spent his life solving the greatest riddle of his age, how to keep time at sea. By 1759, Harrison's marine chronometer, the H4, had proven that a clock could remain accurate even across the roughest voyages. The implications were enormous. Navigation, mapping, an empire itself depended on time. But on land, London still lagged behind. Public clocks drifted, church bells clashed. The sound of one neighborhood's noon could differ from another's by 10 minutes or more. The city needed a master clock, one voice to unite them all. The rise of the clock tower, the solution came not from the merchants or the church, but from Parliament. In the 1730s, discussions began about a new clock for Westminster, one that would be accurate beyond reproach. The idea would not reach fruition until more than a century later, but its seeds were planted in these debates. At the same time, clock towers began appearing on civic buildings across Britain. These were not merely tools, they were monuments. Time had become architecture. The sound of bells no longer just called to prayer, it called to punctuality. In this new age of order, lateness was a sin against progress. The Great Bell of Westminster, a dream in metal, by the early 19th century, London was the largest city in the world. A metropolis of millions, factories and fog. Time now ruled every corner of life. Shifts began at the stroke of a bell, trains departed on minute marks, banks opened at precise hours. Yet Parliament, the heart of the empire, had no great clock of its own. When the old Palace of Westminster burned down in 1834, the opportunity arose to build one. Not just a building, but a symbol. The new Houses of Parliament would be crowned with a tower containing the most accurate clock in the world. In 1844, architect Charles Barry and designer Augustus Pugin submitted their plans. The clock would be visible and audible across the city. The bell, it was decided, would weigh over 13 tons. They called it simply the Great Bell of Westminster. The Whitechapel legacy, the commission for this bell went, once again, to the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, the same foundry that had cast Great Tom and countless others before it. By then, Whitechapel's furnaces had glowed for nearly 3 centuries. The foundry's records were filled with royal commissions and civic contracts. Its craftsmen worked by instinct and ear, their knowledge passed through generations. In 1856, under the direction of George Mears, the foundry began casting the massive bell that would one day become known as Big Ben. The first attempt failed. The bell cracked during testing, its voice ruined. The metal was melted down and recast, heavier, thicker, stronger. The second bell was transported across London on a special carriage drawn by 16 white horses, cheered by thousands of spectators. It took nearly 2 weeks to move it from Whitechapel to Westminster. When it arrived, the city paused to listen. For the first time, London's heartbeat would be fixed to a single note. Synchronization, the empire's new pulse. The story of this bell coincided with another revolution, the synchronization of time across Britain. The invention of the railway in the 1830s demanded uniformity. Trains could not safely operate on local times that differed by minutes or more. In response, railway companies began adopting London time, the time kept by the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. By the 1850s, this became known as Greenwich Mean Time (GMT). Telegraph wires transmitted the Greenwich signal across the country, and soon, clocks in Liverpool, Manchester, and Edinburgh struck in unison with those in London. The empire's vast distances, from India to Canada, were increasingly governed by a single rhythm, measured from a small hill in Greenwich Park. Time had become a system, invisible, standardized, global. When the bell first rang at last on the 31st of May 1859, the great bell of Westminster rang for the first time. Its tone, the note of Eve, reverberated through the fog and rooftops, a sound so deep that it could be felt more than heard. Londoners paused in the streets. Sailors on the Thames turned their heads. The clock that struck it, built by Edward John Dent and completed by his stepson Frederick Dent, was an engineering marvel. It was accurate to within a second, adjusted by small stacks of old coins placed on the pendulum to fine-tune its swing. Each tick, each chime, was a declaration time was no longer local, but absolute. And yet, even in its perfection, the bell bore a flaw. Within months, a crack appeared once again. Its voice changed, slightly duller, slightly sadder, but the crack was never repaired. Instead, it was embraced. That imperfection, Londoners said, gave Big Ben its character. The sound of control with Big Ben's chime. London's relationship with time was transformed. Factories set their shifts by it. Offices and schools synchronized their clocks. The BBC, when founded in the 1920s, used its sound to mark the hour across the world. The bell had become more than metal. It was the pulse of empire, the sound of order and authority. And yet, beneath that order lay a strange contradiction. For centuries, the city had lived by flexible hours, by bells that drifted and contradicted. Now all those ancient sounds were reduced to one bell, one time, one rhythm. The very freedom of time had been disciplined into harmony. As the 19th century closed, London stood as the most punctual city on earth. The great bell of Westminster tolled across the rooftops, through fog and rain, marking hours that could no longer be ignored. But even as it united the city, it silenced others. The bells of parish churches, the cries of street vendors, the unmeasured rhythms of older life. Time, once fluid and local, had become mechanical and global. And yet, as the sound of Big Ben echoed across the river, one question remained: had London mastered time? Or had time finally mastered London? When Big Ben first rang out across London in 1859, it was not just the birth of a bell, it was the beginning of an age in which time itself became the measure of civilization. In the decades that followed, London would come to define punctuality, precision, and schedule. But beneath this ordered surface, there was something more complicated. A human struggle against the very machine it had created. The bell had given London a single rhythm, but at what cost? The clockwork city by the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution had transformed the city into a living mechanism. Factories along the Thames and in the East End no longer relied on sunlight or seasons. They ran on hours, marked by whistles, gongs, and clocks mounted high above the gates. In these factories, time was not just kept, it was consumed. Workers began their shifts at 6 sharp. Breaks lasted precisely 15 minutes. Wages were docked for every minute of lateness. The factory bell replaced the church bell, and the new god of the city was efficiency. Even outside the factories, this new sense of time governed everything. The post was delivered at fixed intervals. The omnibuses along the Strand ran on scheduled routes. The railways departed by the clock's unyielding hand. For the first time in history, Londoners lived their lives according to the tick. The birth of the timekeepers to maintain this new rhythm. Entire professions emerged devoted to the measurement of minutes. The clockmakers and watchmakers of Clerkenwell and Soho thrived. Their shops, small, cluttered, smelling faintly of oil and brass, supplied the city's growing hunger for precision. Apprentices sat at narrow benches, polishing gears so small they could be mistaken for dust. Masters tested each escapement by ear, listening for a steady rhythm, not too fast, not too slow. Every successful watch that left these workshops carried a fragment of London's mechanical soul. By the 1880s, mass production had arrived. Pocket watches, once a luxury, became accessible to clerks, shopkeepers, and labourers. To have the time was no longer a privilege, it was an expectation. London had become not merely a city of time, but a city about time. The sound of Big Ben high above it all, Big Ben continued its patient work. Every quarter hour, the chimes rang out in a sequence known as the Cambridge Quarters, composed in the 1790s and adopted for Westminster's clock. Each sequence, soft, repetitive, musical, was designed to soothe as much as to signal. At the hour, the great bell itself struck. The sound was deep, resonant, and slightly uneven, due to the famous crack in its side. That imperfection gave the tone a warmth, a subtle sadness, as though the bell, too, felt the weight of its endless duty. To Londoners it was comforting, to visitors humbling, to the clockmakers and engineers who maintained it, it was a challenge. Because Big Ben, like all things mechanical, required constant care. Inside the tower, climbing the Elizabeth Tower, as it would later be named, was like entering a living organism. Narrow iron stairs wound upward through the dark stone. The air smelled of oil and dust. At the top sat the clock chamber, a labyrinth of gears, rods, and massive pendulums. The clock itself, designed by Edward John Dent and maintained by his successors, was adjusted by a surprisingly humble method: pennies. Engineers placed old penny coins on the pendulum to fine-tune its timing. Adding a penny made the clock run slightly faster, removing one slowed it down. A single coin could change the accuracy by a fraction of a second per day. This was London's paradox: a vast empire ruled by machines, yet dependent on the gentle weight of a few coins. Every week, the clock's caretakers climbed the tower to wind the mechanism, a ritual of maintenance, devotion, and vigilance. Even storms and bombings could not stop the clock for long. It became, in time, the most reliable heartbeat in the world. The empire of the second, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Britain's empire extended across every ocean. But so too did its time. Greenwich Mean Time (GMT), established in 1884 as the standard for global navigation, soon became the world's reference point. Maps, railways, and telegraphs all depended on it. The Royal Observatory at Greenwich sent signals through undersea cables and radio waves to synchronize clocks from Bombay to Cape Town. It was not just the British Empire of trade and colonies. It was an empire of seconds, radiating outward from a single meridian line marked in a London park. Big Ben, chiming faithfully above Westminster, became its audible emblem. In newspapers, train timetables, and shipping logs, the same hours appeared again and again. London time. Never before had a city imposed its rhythm upon so much of the world. The War of Time. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the sound of Big Ben took on new meaning. For soldiers leaving London, its tolling was often the last familiar sound they heard. For those at home, its chime became a symbol of endurance. Proof that, despite the chaos abroad, the city still kept its steady beat. During the Blitz in World War II, the clock tower was darkened to avoid drawing enemy aircraft. Yet, astonishingly, the bell continued to ring. Even as bombs fell, the people of London heard the same rhythm that had guided their ancestors. Each strike of the bell was an act of defiance. Time, it seemed, could not be conquered, but when one bomb damaged the Commons Chamber in 1941, the bell fell silent for a short time. In that silence, Londoners realized just how much they depended on its voice. When it rang again, crowds gathered on the bridge to listen, not cheering, not shouting, but standing quietly, as though hearing a friend return from war. Time becomes habit. After the wars, the meaning of time changed again. In the post-war decades, clocks multiplied. They appeared in train stations, schools, and factories, in shops, on lampposts, and above doorways. People began to live by schedules so intricate that even moments of rest were measured. The morning tea, the midday lunch break, the evening broadcast, all synchronized to the same unseen rhythm. The sound of Big Ben was now broadcast across the world by the BBC, beginning in 1924. Every night before the news, listeners would hear its chime. For millions, it was more than a sound. It was reassurance. A declaration that time still moved forward, that London still stood, and that order still prevailed. It was the sound of endurance dressed as routine. The silent intervals, and yet even the most reliable clocks sometimes falter. In 2017, Big Ben's chimes were silenced for restoration, the longest pause in its history. The Great Bell was to remain mostly quiet for 4 years, except on special occasions. When it fell silent, Londoners noticed something strange. The city felt different, not louder or quieter exactly, but emptier. It was as though an unconscious rhythm, something everyone had heard but rarely listened to, had been removed. People began to describe it as eerie, unsettling, even sad. For the first time in living memory, London had lost its heartbeat. In that silence, perhaps, the city heard again what it had forgotten: that time is not only measured by machines, but by people, by footsteps, by breaths, by the rhythm of life itself. The return of the bell. When Big Ben rang again in 2022, after years of maintenance, the moment was met with quiet emotion. Crowds gathered once more, just as they had in the 19th century and during the war. The sound rolled across Westminster, through the grey air, familiar and unchanged. Even as London transformed, its skyline crowded with glass towers and digital clocks, that old bronze bell continued to strike with the same wary grace. Its tone still carried the imperfection of its crack, the warmth of its age, and the memory of every hour it had ever measured. It was not a modern sound. It was the sound of endurance, of continuity, a sound that reminded Londoners that, beneath all progress, something ancient still persisted. Time, at last, becomes still today. As you stand by the Thames and listen to the bell, you hear more than just the time. You hear centuries of London's attempts to tame it. You hear the monks at St. Albans striking the first mechanical bells. You hear the curfew bells of the plague years. You hear the hammer that cracked Great Tom. You hear the blackened hands of watchmakers polishing gears by candlelight. And above all, you hear the endless human wish that time might somehow be contained. But it never truly is. Every chime fades. Every hour passes. The bell rings and then silence. The city's clocks may be perfect now, their seconds synchronized to satellites and atomic vibrations. Yet London remains, in some strange way, the same as it ever was, a place that moves to rhythms both human and mechanical, both fleeting and eternal. Time does not belong to the clock, nor the bell. It belongs to the listener. And so, as Big Ben tolls another hour over the river, the question echoes once more, not for London alone, but for all who live within time's patient machinery. When the bell stops, does the city fall silent, or does time simply find another voice? It began, as most great crises do, not with disaster, but with discomfort. By the summer of 1858, London was already the largest city in the world. Nearly 3 million people lived within its boundaries, a population swelling faster than its streets could hold. The River Thames, once the proud heart of the city, had become something else entirely, a moving grave of refuse, filth, and forgotten consequence. And when the heat came that year, a heat thick and airless, the city found itself facing something it could no longer ignore. The newspapers called it the Great Stink. Eyed the river as sewer for centuries, the Thames had been both a source of life and a dumping ground. In medieval times, its waters had carried merchants and fishmongers, pilgrims and thieves. Its current washed away the refuse of 1,000 trades, from the tanners of Bermondsey to the brewers of Southwark. But as the centuries passed and industry grew, so too did the waste. By the 19th century, London's population had exploded beyond anything the medieval planners could have imagined. Narrow streets and open gutters could not carry away the endless tide of human waste, animal remains, and industrial runoff that poured from every corner. Every home had a cesspit, a hole dug beneath the floorboards or behind the house. These were emptied by men known as night soil collectors, who worked by lantern light, hauling away the contents by cart. But as the demand grew, so did the shortcuts. Many cesspits overflowed directly into nearby ditches or streams, and eventually into the Thames itself. When the city installed flush toilets in the early 1800s, the problem worsened. The new plumbing carried waste away from the homes quickly, straight into the same old sewers that emptied into the river. Every flush was an act of denial. The smell of civilization, the Great Stink, was not sudden. It crept upon London, year by year, breath by breath. But the summer of 1858 was exceptional. The sun blazed for weeks without relief. The Thames, low and sluggish, turned from grey to brown, and finally to something resembling tar. Its surface frothed with bubbles of methane and decay. Dead fish floated along the banks. The few remaining boatmen tied scarves around their faces as they rowed through a haze of invisible poison. Those who lived near the river, and there were tens of thousands, found their curtains soaked in the smell. Vinegar was sprinkled on rugs. Perfumed handkerchiefs became essential attire. Lime was poured by the ton along the river's edge in a desperate effort to purify the air. But nothing worked. Members of Parliament, whose chambers sat directly beside the Thames, found themselves gagging as they debated. Windows were draped with curtains soaked in chloride of lime. Still, the stench seeped through. On June 30, 1858, one reporter from the Times described it plainly. There is nothing figurative in the appalling condition of the river. It stinks. The line became legend, brutal in its simplicity. The great institutions of empire, the wealth of the industrial world, the moral pride of Victorian progress, all brought low by a smell. The science of fear. For decades, Londoners had lived under the shadow of cholera, a disease that struck without warning, bringing vomiting, cramps, and death within hours. Outbreaks in 1832, 1848, and 1854 had killed tens of thousands, but no one quite understood why. The prevailing belief, shared by doctors and scientists alike, was the miasma theory. That disease was carried through bad air or foul vapors. The Great Stink seemed to prove it beyond doubt. If the smell could travel, then surely the sickness could too. It was fear more than reason that finally moved Parliament to act. Not compassion for the poor who lived knee-deep in filth, nor concern for the labourers who drank from the same river that carried their waste, but the terror that the stink might kill them as well. IV. A man with a plan entered Joseph Bazalgette, a name still unfamiliar to most outside of London, yet one that reshaped the modern world. Bazalgette was an engineer of precision and patience. Born in 1819, he had spent years designing railway lines and bridges before being appointed chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1856. His temperament was methodical, his handwriting meticulous. He was not a dreamer but a builder, the sort of man who understood that cities were not born from visions, but from calculations. Long before the Great Stink, Bazalgette had drawn plans for an underground network of brick-lined sewers that would intercept waste before it reached the Thames, but Parliament had ignored him. Too costly, too complex, too radical. Now, with MPs clutching handkerchiefs to their faces, they were suddenly more receptive. The grand design, Bazalgette's plan was monumental. He proposed 82 miles of main intercepting sewers, connected to over 1,000 miles of smaller drains running deep beneath the city. These tunnels would collect waste from homes and streets, then carry it eastward, away from central London, where it would be released into the Thames far beyond the city limits. The idea was not to remove the waste entirely, but to remove it from sight and smell. At the heart of the system were massive pumping stations, designed not merely as utilities but as architectural achievements, grand structures of iron and brick. The Crossness pumping station on the south bank of the Thames became known as the Cathedral of Sewage. Its ironwork gleamed with floral motifs, its machinery painted in bright colours, as though to elevate its grim purpose into art. Bazalgette's brickwork was famously overbuilt, each tunnel thick enough to endure centuries. When asked why, he replied simply, "We're only going to do this once, and there's always the unforeseen." He was right. His foresight would save the city again and again. Digging beneath the empire, the construction of the sewers was one of the greatest engineering efforts of the Victorian age. Thousands of labourers, navvies, as they were called, toiled day and night. They dug through clay silt and gravel with pickaxes and spades, their bodies coated in mud, their lungs filled with dust. The air underground was thick and damp, lit only by gas lamps and candles. Timber supports groaned under the weight of the city above. Floods and cave-ins were common. So were explosions from trapped methane. The pay was meagre, the hours endless, and the work dangerous. Yet for many, it was steady employment in a city that offered little else. Every brick laid beneath London carried a name, a story, a moment of endurance. And slowly, almost invisibly, the city began to change. The river revived by 1865. The first sections of Bazalgette's system were complete. The difference was immediate. The water ran clearer. The smell receded. And though cholera would not be fully understood for years, the true cause, contaminated water, not air, would later be proven by Dr. John Snow. The new sewer system effectively ended the great outbreaks. By moving waste away from the water supply, Bazalgette had saved tens of thousands of lives without ever realizing exactly how. The Thames, once the city's shame, began to recover. Fish returned. Barges no longer stuck fast in sludge. The embankments, built as part of the sewer project, gave London new promenades and parks. What had begun as a desperate response to a smell had transformed into the foundation of a modern metropolis. The quiet legacy. Joseph Bazalgette never sought fame. When he died in 1891, his obituary praised him modestly as an eminent engineer. Yet historians now estimate that his work saved more lives than any general, any monarch, or any doctor of his age. Beneath the streets of London, his brick tunnels still carry their silent burden, still functioning after more than a century and a half. You can walk above them today without ever noticing. The city breathes because he built its lungs. But perhaps the strangest thing of all is this. The Great Stink, that unbearable smell which once brought a city to its knees, is almost forgotten. What remains instead is the quiet hum of pumps, the whisper of unseen flow, the sound of London breathing underground. And yet, as the city flourished and the river ran cleaner, a new question began to emerge. If London could bury its filth so completely, what else might it choose to hide beneath its surface? The crisis of 1858 had forced London's hand, and Joseph Bazalgette's grand design had been approved with uncharacteristic speed. But approval was only the beginning. Now came the work, years of digging, bricklaying, measuring, and managing, all conducted in silence below a city that never stopped moving. Above ground, Parliament debated and merchants traded. Below, in the dark, a different London was being born. The engine beneath the empire. At the height of construction, more than 20,000 labourers worked across the city. They dug trenches, bored tunnels, and laid millions upon millions of bricks. The men were known as navvies, short for navigators, a term inherited from those who had dug Britain's canals a century earlier. They were rough men, itinerant and strong. many from Ireland and the north of England. Their language was peppered with curses, songs, and nicknames that no official record bothered to note. They lived in temporary huts near the work sites, their beds stacked in tiers like ship bunks. Meals were simple bread, cheese, beer, and whatever could be cooked over a small fire. Each morning, they descended into the tunnels carrying lanterns, picks, and the stubborn endurance of men who had little choice but to keep working. For most of them, the sewers were not a monument, they were a living. The tools of precision, the success of Bazalgette's vision depended on accuracy. Every tunnel had to slope downward at just the right gradient, not too steep, not too shallow, so that waste would flow by gravity alone. The difference between success and failure could be measured in inches. Surveyors walked the city with theodolites, mapping every rise and dip of the streets above. Their notes, written in neat copperplate, guided teams of bricklayers who often worked by candlelight in waist-deep muck. Each brick was set by hand, curved perfectly to form the arched ceilings of the tunnels. The mortar, a careful mixture of lime and sand, was spread by men whose movements became mechanical, rhythmical, almost meditative. To the casual observer, it might have seemed monotonous. To the men who did it, it was survival. The weight of the city, working underground, was never safe. The soil beneath London varied wildly: clay, gravel, and sand layered in unpredictable ways. A wrong strike of a pickaxe could send an entire wall collapsing. Flooding was constant. Water seeped through the earth, carrying silt and gas. In the darker tunnels, where air was scarce, men sometimes collapsed without warning, victims of carbon dioxide buildup or methane ignition. The engineers installed air shafts, pumps, and candles to detect dangerous gases, but even with precautions, the work was perilous. There were stories whispered among the navvies, of tunnels that filled suddenly with water, of men entombed by collapsing earth, of bodies never recovered. No memorials were built for them. Their names, if recorded at all, appeared only in payroll ledgers and death certificates. Yet without them, London's greatest act of sanitation would never have existed. IV. The machinery of purification, while the tunnels crept beneath the city, the pumping stations rose above it, monumental structures of brick and iron, each designed with a kind of grim magnificence. At Crossness, near the southern outfall, 4 colossal beam engines lifted millions of gallons of waste daily. Each engine was named with Victorian dignity: Victoria, Prince Consort, Albert Edward, and Alexandra. Their massive flywheels turned with ponderous grace, driven by steam boilers that hissed and roared through the long shifts. The building itself was astonishing, its cast iron columns painted in reds and greens, its ceiling carved with floral patterns. Bazalgette and his architects believed that even the foulest labour should be housed in beauty. It was an act of civic pride, and perhaps of penance. The Thames embankments above ground. Bazalgette's influence reshaped London's very geography. The Victoria, Chelsea, and Albert embankments were constructed as part of the sewer system, vast retaining walls that contained the river's edge and hid the underground tunnels within. These embankments not only carried waste but also housed new roads, gardens, and underground pipes for gas and water. What had once been marshy, foul-smelling shorelines became promenades lined with lampposts and benches. Gentlemen strolled where cesspits had once overflowed. In time, Londoners forgot that beneath their feet ran the arteries of their city's rebirth. The engineer's burden, Joseph Bazalgette, was no showman. He rarely spoke in public, preferring reports to rhetoric. But his work consumed him. He reviewed every measurement personally, every curve and slope of the tunnels. He wrote endless letters to contractors, city officials, and politicians, each one careful, precise, and unfailingly polite. When Parliament delayed funding or quibbled over details, he persisted quietly, convinced of the project's necessity. His colleagues said he carried the entire system in his mind, a map so vast and intricate that no one else could quite grasp it.